Hey guys, Reploid Bill, ReploidProductions.com, coming at you with an iCollect, and today I'm going to be going over the entire Gamecube Collection. This is going to be a two-part video because there's a lot to cover, so I need to just go ahead and get started right now. First off, Sonic Riders. Sonic Riders, it's if anybody's ever played the Sonic Rally Racing, this is kind of what led to that. It's a lot of like snowboarding and things like that, more like skateboardy type things or rollerblades, but essentially it's still the same thing, it just doesn't have cars in it. So there's that for you. Next, Metroid Prime. When it was first announced, pretty much everybody said the same thing. You cannot do Metroid in 3D. It was assumed that it was another one of those titles that was not going to make the jump properly. And if you'll remember, even N64 did not even try. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, there was no Metroid at all for N64 because they were worried of that exact thing. But when they finally got around to doing it, they did it right. Next is this toy. This is the Master Quest for Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. These are, in my opinion, no matter what Nintendo says and no matter what that stupid book you read says, these games were created on the idea that each game should be its own game and make money. They really weren't trying to link these games together until recently when they had said, well, yeah, all of it is a single storyline. That's bull. I don't want to get into it right now, but it's just not true. This was the only time that I knew of until I was told about the Wind Waker that there was an actual direct sequel to a game. So they put both of them into one collection. And then we have this, which is kind of funny that I bought that because this is Zelda 1, Zelda 2, Wind Waker, I'm sorry, not Wind Waker, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask. It's all 4 games, and there's really nothing special about it except for you can save. And anybody that's bought a copy of Zelda recently, as I did just recently, they don't work. The internal battery is dead and you can't save. It's just like an old Final Fantasy that's been played to death. But luckily, for people that don't want to mess with their games, and I'm one of those people, I don't want to break my game open because there's always that chance that it's not going to work again after you change out that battery. Now we will be able to save again because the Retron 5 is going to have an internal hard drive. There's Spyro the Dragon. Yeah. Enter the Dragonfly. It's somewhat of a Bruce Lee reference there, and I still don't care. Second Sight. Second Sight was one of those games that tried to capitalize on a more adult audience. And I'm not one of those guys that's going to sit here and tell you that Nintendo markets to children. It just sometimes feels that way because Nintendo's mascot is Mario. But if we could just step off of our egos for a minute and fall back to PlayStation 1, does anybody remember who Sony's mascot was for a while? Remember Crash Bandicoot? That wasn't exactly something you could guarantee was marketed towards adults. So it's just something that's been stuck on Nintendo for a long time, and there were more adult games out there. It was just that Nintendo's market has always been more about advertising towards your family because they wanted everybody to be a part of their system, where Sony was always more advertising towards your 19-year-old area, or for that matter, the Xbox always seemed to be more of a mature 23, somewhere in there. The reason I say this is because Halo was pretty much their mascot for a long time. And I'm not just referencing mascots. The idea that it was a fully online system from day one kind of changed the toy aspect of it, because at the time, you didn't go online with these systems. Even the GameCube could go online, but it was a real weird way of going online, where you would take the disc and put it in the computer and play it from your computer, and it really wasn't worth the hassle. But let's go ahead and stop ranting and just let you know that it was alright. I don't really care for the game, all in all, but it was one of those games that kind of broke that boundary that let you know that it was marketing to the family. There were games that you could play as an adult, there were games you could play as a child, and there were games that you could play no matter what age you were. Like Custom Robo. Custom Robo, you're a kid, you play with toys. The imagination of the game is that as you play with these toys, you see these big extreme battles. You jump and shoot lasers and throw big swords and all kinds of crazy stuff. As you win, you collect more toys. Cooler toys in your collection allows you to have bigger fights around your neighborhood. It sounds a little ridiculous, but actually it's well done, and it's a lot of fun to collect parts and create new toys and things like that, and build a foundation. Now, remember what I just said about Nintendo, and some games were definitely meant for adults. Resident Evil 4 was released on the GameCube first. I experienced this game first on my PlayStation, but when it comes down to it, GameCube did have it first, and it was exclusive until enough people cried about it and made a fuss to get it on the other system. And it's solid. It really is. I will say that on the PlayStation 2, it's more solid because I like the controller better to start out with. And then aside from that, it also had more content. Now, that's not always a winner because sometimes the content is something very lame. But in the case of this, it actually really did expand the game, and it looks better on the PS2. And I hate to really bash anything about this game, because this is a great game, so I'm not going to say anything bad. I'm just going to let me say that it was on the GameCube first, and it was great. Hands down, a great game. Basically, the reason I bought a GameCube was because all of the Resident Evils, after a while, were released on the GameCube, and I was having trouble tracking them down, where one day at a game store I happened to find the entire lineup in one row. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, Code Veronica, bam, the whole thing. And I just picked the whole thing up and bought a GameCube for 60 bucks, and I've played it ever since. So I got into the GameCube through Resident Evil, so nothing bad can really be said there. And just to say, this is Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, which actually I believe is an underrated game, and I don't want to get into too much of it because that kind of makes this a review, and that's not what it's meant to be. But Resident Evil 3 was great, and if you want to see more on Resident Evil 3, there is a chairs discussion on Resident Evil in general, speaking of the entire series. So if you haven't seen that, you can click the Reploid Productions, or you can go to our Reploid Productions YouTube if you're not watching this there, and there should be a playlist for the chairs. You can look that up, and it'll be the Resident Evil discussions, and for that matter, anything else you could possibly think of will be in that playlist that you can also go in and check out. Or if there's something you would like us to discuss in the chairs, you can leave comments on those videos, and I'll be sure to check those out and see what I can do for you. But moving on, Resident Evil 2. It's kind of weird, actually, the Resident Evil 2 came out for the GameCube, and I think the only reason it did was to complete the series, because Resident Evil 1 was on PlayStation, then there was the remake, but when Resident Evil 2 came out, it was on the PlayStation, and then it was put on the N64. So Nintendo already had their hands in Resident Evil and was already playing on the N64, so there wasn't really any other reason to port this aside from allowing you to complete your entire collection on a single system and not have to hook something old up in order to go back and enjoy the series. You could actually start at 1 and go to 2 and go to 3 and go to 4 all on one system without ever having to change your controller. And I'm pretty sure that's the only reason, aside from money, that this was put out. But it's solid. It's just as good as it was on the PlayStation, except for I prefer the PlayStation controller more. And this is Resident Evil 2. It's bizarre, right? I already bought this game once, and then it was given to me a second time by a friend, so just in case something ever happens to my Resident Evil 2, I have Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil. This blew me away. It wasn't enough that Resident Evil already was a great game, but this just took it a step further. 2 discs, a great game with graphics that rivaled what we were seeing on the Xbox at the time, and that is a credit to the GameCube, because the GameCube was considered to be the weakest of the systems, and as far as I'm concerned, Code Veronica came out for the Code Veronica X came out for the PlayStation 2, and this looked better. Not only was it a remake of the best Resident Evil that we played in terms of scare value, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that it was the first time we'd really had that experience, but regardless, this gave me everything I needed to go back to the series. 1, it was Resident Evil 1 and it looked great. 2, it still had the same experience that I'd played before, but 3, it added on top of what was already a great foundation and gave me even more to play with, to the point where if I go back to play Resident Evil 1, even if it's the director's cut, it's not as enjoyable as simply playing it on my GameCube. So Resident Evil 1 for the GameCube is a win, hands down. And then there's Resident Evil 0. This was the first time that they tried the partner aspect. There was another person that walked around with you, and sometimes they would fire with you and help you through things or boost you up to a level, and it wasn't implemented as well as when they tried it again in Part 5. But I don't want to get into Part 5 either, because I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's because zombies were not in Part 5, because anybody that's a huge fan of the series knows that it was not actually intended to be a zombie game in the first place. The actual name of the game was Biohazard, and it was supposed to be about different biological weapons or forms of chemical warfare, diseases, and they weren't necessarily supposed to be zombies, but maybe even crazed people some of the time. That's why Part 4 deals with the Pelagus, and Part 1 deals with more of a genetic manipulative virus that reanimates dead bodies, and then if you go into even the first, second, third game have creatures that are created from different tests with the same type of drug. Everything from the licker to the hunter to the dogs. They're not necessarily zombie dogs. And then going from that, if you think to, I already said Part 4 has the Pelagus, Part 0 dealt with this leech type of thing that got in your body and messed you up and turns you into a thing. So I'm not going to continue this, because as I said before, there's already a chairs discussion on this whole thing, so if you want to know more about my opinions on that, go check that out. This was Mega Man Command Mission, because Mega Man was already in a fighting game, Mega Man was already in a racing game, and Mega Man was already in a soccer game. Don't play it, it's terrible. And aside from that, it was also Mega Man, the normal game where you scroll from left to right and you shoot, and Mega Man X expanded that, so they thought, why not try RPG Mega Man? I played this for about 4 hours. I've never put it back in the system. So, take that however you will. This was Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, and it was good. I mean, they'd already proven that they could do it in 3D, but then Part 2 took it a step further and felt even more... felt more epic, I guess is what I'm trying to say. At least it did to me. I liked the bad guy concept a lot more than I liked in Part 1. Then there's this Gotcha Force. Gotcha Force is, again, another custom robo, almost. They're almost the same game. That's if I'm not mistaken. From what I remember, they're about the same game. So, if you've never played it, you're basically a kid that plays with toys and you have epic battles and you collect more toys and fight other kids. Oh, and there's a storyline, but nobody cares. The last game on my list for part 1 is one of the biggest deals in GameCube history. I'm ending on a high note here. This was Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. From what I hear, the rumor went like this. Hideo Kojima was on a train or something like that, either on a train or he was having lunch, and somehow he met up with the creator of Mario. Now, they get talking for a little bit, and at one point, he simply says, "Hey, why don't you make Metal Gear for the GameCube?" And that was it. That was all it took. Right there. Decision made. So, that Miyamoto basically just said, "Hey, yeah?" And Hideo was like, "I'm not really doing nothing." So, this game came out. They redid the graphics, added a couple things. Essentially, I guess you could say it's part 1 if part 1 had been made during part 2. Because the engine that they use allows you to hang from ledges and go into the first-person view, and it gives you a lot more range in your movement. Like, if you remember right, when you were running past something, and you used to hit the button to crouch, you would simply stop and lay right down. Where in part 2, you would do like a little dive and a roll. Well, the dive and roll was added into this game. So, little things like that that made the experience that much better, and also the visual effect that it had. And they brought in the choreographers from The Matrix to redo all the action scenes. So you'll notice that, like, when he fights the ninja and whatnot, it's way more extreme than probably it even needed to be. My only tiff with this game is that they redid the voice acting. They could have copied and pasted that voice acting. The story doesn't change at all. It was the same actors saying the same lines, except for one guy. They replaced the voice actor for Gray Fox, and I'm not okay with that. The new guy sucked. That was my part 1 collection of GameCube. So these both should be posted at the exact same time. So if you liked this one, go ahead and check out the second one now.